This story's called Shattered Moon by Accomplished Oil 611 on the HFY subreddit. Admiral Charles T. Glover III had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for 3 days when the moon cracked. He didn't notice at first. In fact, he was quite enjoying the well-deserved round of golf after the ceremony, speeches, and awkward phone conversation he'd endured. It wasn't brought to his attention by NORAD or NASA, but by his niece. She had caused more than her share of trouble, requiring her mother, who was the Admiral's sister, to call in a favor. Now, the child was serving penance by spending her Saturday morning as his caddy. She'd been daydreaming, thinking about a boy she wasn't quite sure she liked when she saw it. The sun was still rising in the east, and the moon hovered just above the horizon to the west, when a spear of light appeared to erupt out of the two sides of the moon's surface. "Wow," she said, as if watching a fireworks display. To this, the Admiral took notice. It was the first positive-sounding thing she'd said all day. A half hour later, the Admiral was in a helicopter talking over a secure line with the President. He was accompanied by his attaché, USAF Lieutenant Colonel Joy Jackson. Joy would not describe her job as particularly joyful. Her specialty was in making problems disappear, while the Admiral's specialty appeared to be in making problems appear or reappear or get worse when she was gone, making hers a full-time job. Of course, part of the problem with making issues disappear is that they cease being important. The Admiral only dealt with important matters, so regardless of his staff's high praise for her, he was often left unimpressed. The Admiral actually thought Joy was relatively incompetent. However, like any good athlete, gambler, or soldier, he was also very superstitious. And Joy happened to be his good luck charm. Joy did not consider herself lucky. She did, however, consider herself smart. For instance, she had only heard one-sided conversation, Admiral answering with yes or no over the phone, but knew he was placating the President, likely telling him that yes, he would indeed be safe deep in the Virginia bunker, and no, he wasn't in terrible danger, and yes, he could still watch Netflix, and no, there wasn't any snacks. She also knew that he was, for use of some Air Force slang, flying by the seat of his pants. Arriving at Langley, the Admiral called for his crew, as he called it, to meet him at the Pentagon. This was his entourage of generals and directors that ran the Core Defense Network. However, it reminded Joy more of a frat house than a powerful decision-making body it professed to be. The conference room in the south wing of the enormous building contained 12 chairs surrounding an enormous oak desk that faced a giant projection screen. Behind the screen was an entire squad of soldiers working overtime to feed information into the screen to be ingested, and then likely ignored by the Admiral. Wrapping around the room were a series of smaller, far more uncomfortable chairs. As people poured in, Joy strategically took a chair in the back. On the screen, what they saw was terrifying. The video started with a standard NASA display of the moon. The video was an ultra-high resolution, but the monitor was not, so it came out just a bit grainy. A moment later, there was a flash which appeared simultaneously on both sides. Following the flash, white-hot material started pouring into space as enormous geysers before turning red and raining back down as debris. In doing so, the moon appeared to grow, and then something truly odd happened. The moon began to breathe. "So, what are we looking at?" asked the Admiral. A man speaking through the conference phone spoke up. "Sir, this is Dr. John Casper, USGS Director." "USGS," replied the Admiral in confusion. "Yes, United States Geological Survey. I was invited by NASA. What you're looking at is the impact of something very small, but moving at incredibly high speed. It appears to have pierced both sides of the moon, and what you're seeing are the ripples of energy waves moving through the moon and across its surface. Basically, a giant earthquake, or moonquake, is occurring during the extraordinary heat and pressure generated internally." "Do we have any idea if this poses any current danger?" "Yes, Admiral," said another general, waiting impatiently for an opportunity to speak. "We have lost all satellite communications, and the entire west coast appears to be dark. No communications in or out." This was a problem that the Admiral couldn't tackle, so this would be his fight. "Okay, sounds like a military problem. Do we still have contact with NORAD?" There was a crackle from the phone as Dr. Casper tried to continue, but he was immediately cut off to free up the line for military matters. This was Joy's cue to excuse herself. To her surprise, she was able to reacquire contact using a restricted phone from an unused nearby office that read CSA. She knew the Army chief and he would not be caught dead in his office during an emergency. "Okay, Dr. Casper, let's hear the full story," she said. The doctor, clearly flustered from being disconnected earlier, was impatient to make his point. "You need to keep watching that video. The moon is coming apart. Those initial glowing geysers are shooting thousands of tons of rock into space. Some is going to come raining down on Earth. The quakes are going to become stronger as the moon reaches its perigee. If it comes apart, then you could see mountains raining down on the planet. This is not a nuclear emergency. This is a global extinction event." "Calm down," stated Joy. "This is not time to panic." "This is exactly the time to panic," reported the doctor. "Okay, Let's schedule panic for later with a therapist then. What can we do now? Who do we talk to? I don't know. NASA? SpaceX? Lockheed? None of it matters. You can't stop a mountain. No, you can't, thought Joy. What about evacuation or hitting the rocks with a nuke? Your department, Joy decided to make a mental note to call a therapist at her earliest convenience. Heading down into the meeting, she didn't look forward to interrupting the Admiral. Sir, she said, entering the room. The Admiral and his crew looked at her. We have a bigger problem than phones and satellites. It appears the moon is unraveling. According to USGS, we have approximately 3 months before internal pressures create a colossal eruptive event, pushing large chunks of the moon into an elliptical orbit. If pieces collide with each other, they could rapidly deorbit and come raining down on top of us. That doesn't sound like a military problem, replied the Admiral. I'm sorry, sir, but if it's true, we're looking at mass evacuations, bunker building, martial law. The Admiral did like the sound of martial law. He felt like it gave him superpowers. Taking a moment, he recited a favorite quote in his head to cheer himself up. With greater responsibility comes greater power. He was pretty sure Spider-Man's uncle said that. I'm an uncle too, he thought in solidarity with himself. Reluctantly, he commanded that a current image of the moon be redisplayed. Moments later, they had the feed. The moon had taken on a look of a cracked eggshell with an enormous glowing chasm forming all across its surface. As the image they watched zoomed in, they could see down to a nearly molten core as volcanic lightning crackled up through the hot dust within the cracks. As they watched, the visual imagery gave way to a cartoon showing the worst-case prediction. As the moon passed its nearest point, it deformed into an egg-like shape, the internal energy concentrated at its foci. The squeezing produced so much power that it explosively erupted an ocean of rocks. The rocks shot out into orbit but began getting pulled back into the moon's own gravity, forming a ring of dust. However, because the debris was coming from both sides of the moon, the ring was colliding with itself. The collided particles then slowed and left the orbit of the moon entirely, instead of getting slowly pulled towards Earth. Everyone in the room, of course, knew the truth that some of the particulates would be the size of Mount Everest, if not larger. Everyone, that is, except the Admiral, whose mind had largely drifted back to Spider-Man. As the video ended, the Admiral quickly snapped out of his trance. What's the timeline for this event, he asked. We expect it to reach the point within a year, maybe sooner, said Dr. Casper, who'd reluctantly invited to the meeting. So, we got a year, said the Admiral with enthusiasm. Anyone think they can keep the President in the bunker for that long? The room erupted in laughter. Joy felt sick. Joy didn't notice as days turned into weeks, but as the first month passed, she did recognize one thing. The models were far too conservative. The military had been able to stably launch another satellite, but it didn't have any planes. Reports were coming out regularly now. Something big had hit China. No one knows exactly when, but it was closer to the moon at the time the moon was impacted. So speculation was full of rumors. Did China have something to do with it? Did China get hit by the same object the moon did? Did little green men have something against the Chinese? What kind of crazy fortune cookie had someone opened? The rumors got more tasteless from there. Joy wasn't much for rumors, but she did know one thing. The report indicated that the Chinese were all but gone. For the most part, the United States had been lucky, if you can call it that. The entire West Coast took the brunt of the electromagnetic pulse. The same way that killed the satellites had enough power in the region to break through the magnetosphere and knock out the electrical grid, vehicles, and most electronics. Within the day, portions of the West Coast had been devastated. Fast-moving meteorites, likely from the original moon impact, landed across the region. This, in turn, caused all sorts of geological events and virtually destroyed the area around large cities such as Los Angeles. As it happened well before any sort of communications could be restored, people had no idea what was happening and no way to get help. It resulted in panic across the West. A stampede of people tried to migrate inland. Many arrived in the Colorado mountains just as it was too hit. First with debris that turned the sky red with the raining fire of a million shooting stars, and then the larger pieces that caused massive rock slides, even volcanic activity in some areas. A later report also showed debris hitting the ocean, creating a giant tsunami. These rose hundreds of feet and proved very costly to both coasts, hitting near Florida and Seattle. By month 2, Joy had started to drink. Reports had come in that terrible extremist militias and general lawlessness throughout the West. People were growing desperate. There were even rumors of miracles, but it was all despair disguised as hope. Like a groundhog, the president occasionally popped out of his bunker to ask a few questions. The best scientists looked for solutions to the problem. Similarly, the national laboratories modeled all the military options. They all came back with an answer, the same answer: run and hide. So, the U.S. built deep bunkers and giant submarines to give as many people the illusion of safety as possible. The world followed suit. It was the 3rd month, and the perigee had arrived. Joy looked up into the sky and saw the supermoon, but it was no longer a moon. It was a terror dancing in the sky and bearing down on everyone. She looked up and stared, seeing dust and debris mixed with mountains of rock and fire pulsing with lightning and crackling with sparks as a living demon. A Balrog, thought Joy. By the fourth month, it was clear what was going to happen, and it was happening far faster than predictions. The moon had erupted much of its surface into space. Several collisions had occurred in orbit, and rocks bigger than mountains were now hurtling towards Earth. According to estimates, the smaller pieces would land in days and the larger ones within a week. The president had taken post on a U.S. ballistic submarine, while many others found shelter however they could. Many had joined the military for some level of purpose and stability. They were directing different projects as martial law was now in effect. This included building shelters, but mainly focused on simply ensuring society continued for what it's worth. Really, it was just people hoping to make a difference or trying to stay busy in those final days. They came from everywhere. They brought their stories, their rumors, and their myths with them. The rumors continued to grow in the wake of approaching doom. A woman floating through the air, a meteorite inexplicably bouncing off the atmosphere. Soldiers had spread them, soldiers she trusted. One man had saved her life when the militias attacked. Then, with more passion than she'd seen in what felt like forever, he told her a story. The story was insane. Joy decided to investigate anyway. After all, hope was all she had left. It was a day before she was convinced that the rumor was true. It was another day before she found the woman at the center of it all. She was just a young girl. She had lived in Los Angeles when it hit. She escaped the fires. She had escaped the storms with winds exceeding any hurricane. She survived the tsunami, escaped the militia, traveled through the danger zones and the deadliest no-go regions of the West. She had traveled all the way to Joy's doorstep just to ask to go back to Los Angeles through all the danger to find the key to humanity's survival. The key was her sister. Joy approached the Admiral, but the story was too unbelievable. So she took initiative. She was a pilot. She had the clearance, so she hijacked a plane. She grabbed the soldiers, and they grabbed their rifles, ropes, and survival gear, and they left. She wouldn't be noticed as she headed west. The world was ending. Who cares about a plane? Los Angeles airport was gone, and the roads were swamped with dead and abandoned vehicles. There was no time left, so they landed on the beach. It was hard, but they survived. Joy was sure of one thing landing there. The plane would never fly again. Within an hour, the soldiers had found the girl's sister, her work, and her friends. They found her in a basement, a sub-basement, only deeper still. A beautiful ancient place that shouldn't exist. A place lost in time. The sister was starving. Her friends were injured, but they were alive. After offering some relief, Joy sat down with her to get her story. The woman was a scientist, or at least studied to become one. She had stumbled onto something, or rather her younger sister had. They had developed it in secret, but not really in secret. There were many adventures, but then the fun ended. As a piece of the moon fell, they formed a plan. It was audacious, but they had done it. Now they needed to go, and Joy knew where. It was ridiculous, but it was their only chance. The soldiers grabbed everything, the tools, the science experiments, even an apparatus the scientists insisted on bringing. They placed it all on a pallet, a floating pallet. Magic? Asked a soldier. The scientist just laughed. That's what I thought too, she replied. They had spent hours moving the equipment to the plane that would never fly. The soldiers kept busy going back and again to get more items. The scientists used the time to outfit the plane with something. Gunshots in the distance rang out as the soldiers encountered the militia. Then in the distance, beyond the beach, they saw the ocean explode upwards. The shore began to recede into the distance. A wave is coming. Joy wasn't on the plane. She wished she was on the plane, but she was fighting the militia. They had seemingly come out of nowhere as if they were waiting to conduct an ambush. Were they looking for something? Joy thought. The scientist's story, unbelievable as it seemed, now appeared incomplete. Joy pondered the injuries of the boys in the shelter, but only momentarily. The militia was advancing. Then she saw it. Above her team was the unflyable C-130 transport plane she had ditched on the beach. It was just hovering there, suspended in the sky for a long moment before gradually descending. The soldiers rushed in as it landed, bringing the last piece of hardware, the apparatus which the scientists insisted was important. As they ascended, Joy saw the wave. She momentarily wondered if the plane could surf, but they just missed hitting the crest of the epic wave as it swept in. Maybe I'm lucky, thought Joy. Certainly the militia was not. As the day quickly fell to night, the plane raced forwards at increasing speed. They were headed to Grand Gulf Nuclear Station in Port Gibson, Mississippi. Hoping beyond hope that it was still operating, above them there were no stars. Instead, there were a multitude of large moons in the sky. These giant shining orbs were close and visibly growing as the plane made its journey. They landed like a helicopter descending onto a parking lot. To the dismay of the few car owners, there wasn't an empty lot. The sheriff had been contacted and worked heroically to track down the essential plant personnel, most of whom were either at home, the church, or one of the few bars remaining open. Upon landing, the team unloaded the gear and quickly transported it to a placement already set up. and had been rapidly constructed by the few reckless and slightly intoxicated engineers accompanied by a very knowledgeable and highly inebriated electrician. Working together, the team quickly assembled the hardware they'd brought into a large tilting lift equipped with side-mounted telescope. They then placed the apparatus upright and mounted it to the lift. Finally, lifting the platform, they began the hard work of assembling an extra-large laser underneath. Joy was now deeply curious to know what the device she had nearly lost her life retrieving would do, particularly as the moon-like objects now appeared as mountains hanging just above them. After what seemed like an eternity, they hooked up the laser terminals using a massively large cable. They were ready. The scientist double-checked the settings, looking nervous. Joy asked her what was wrong, and she simply stated, "If you believe in God, now's the time to pray." Fire enveloped the sky as the mountains breached the atmosphere. Using the side-mounted telescope, the scientists took aim and flipped the switch. Immediately, they heard the sound of air being pushed like a vortex towards the device. The scientists hadn't anticipated this, and unfortunately, one of the soldiers, Joy's friend in fact, who was also closest to the device, was unable to hold his footing and was swept towards the vortex of wind. The first thing he thought was, "I'm gone." Except he wasn't exactly gone. In fact, he was fine, feeling no acceleration as he was swept at insane speeds towards the burning space mountain. The second thing he thought was, "That mountain of fire is going to hit me," except it wasn't. It too was flying off into the distance. Then, for some inexplicable reason, gravity took hold, and he slowed his ascent, stopped, and began to fall. The last thing he thought was, "So, this is what those cows feel like in a tornado." He was dead right. He had finally found time to catch up with the situation and regain his wits when someone reached out and caught him. It was Joy. She could barely believe it, but she was flying using a tweaked-out pair of boots the scientists threw at her. He, on the other hand, wasn't thinking about anything more. He was just happy to be alive. The mountain was repelled, in fact, shattered into another, even larger mountain behind it, and continued on. 1 year later, the Earth was safe, and the moon had a stable new ring. It was gorgeous with multiple colors that held a warmth which would help the world below to recover. Still, there'd be a long road to rebuild, which was more important than ever, particularly because the analysis of the object's trajectory finally came back. As the debris in space began to clear, something else became noticeable for those so inclined to look. There are many very large and extremely beautiful new rings surrounding Venus and Mars. Joy still had a lot of work to do, because the consensus was that they missed. That was Shattered Moon by Accomplished Oil 611 on the HFY subreddit. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.